Jillian Williams. I am a principal at Anthemis Group, which is an early stage fintech-focused venture capital firm. We define fintech pretty broadly, but everything sort of financial services, insurance, real estate, and then some health a little bit, and then sort of like we call it data technology and infrastructure, but really any of the backbones or interesting data sets that can apply to the fintech and financial services space. We're early stage investors, so I'd say our sweet spot is anywhere between pre-seed to Series A. So typically it can be as early as a founder with an idea through to a product already launched and a real team. I'd say my personal favorite is probably more of that seed stage, so right in between. And we typically look to lead rounds. So want to be active investors, want to take board seats, and want to be as helpful as possible with our companies as well. I've been with Anthemis for 4 years. And I guess also we invest across the US and Europe. So sort of agnostic across the US. I'd say a lot of our portfolio companies, just because I'm typically based in New York, come from New York, but we also have LA, Denver, Boston, Chicago, and I think one in maybe Atlanta as well. So kind of agnostic. We have some in San Francisco as well, of course, but given we're not based there, it's not really where we try to focus all of our time. And then also across Europe, because we have a pretty big team over there. And prior to Anthemis, as I said, I think I've been with the team for 4 years. When we opened the US office, I was in more traditional finance at Barclays and Goldman before that.
Nice. Yeah. So lots of experience and knowledge that you can give us kind of on the back end as it relates to kind of financial services in the space that you're in now and some of your previous roles as well. So I like to kind of just go into a description of what we'll be talking about today and then kind of launch into the questions. Ladies, as you all know, that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please just drop them in the Q&A box or in the chat box and we will make sure that they are answered. So the recipe for a successful business is one brilliant idea, strong enthusiasm, and initial capital. I'm sure there's a long list of other things that can go into that, but I think those will be our first 3 key things that we need to kind of get our idea off the ground. Before you rush into the investment process, stop for a second and think whether it's worth the implementation. Yes, your business idea might have seemed perfect as soon as it came to your mind, and while at first glance, it might even appear flawless. Every business idea I've had, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a millionaire idea out here. But that is actually incredibly far from the truth. Before you start raising funds in the project, the main thing is to understand the various stages in its life cycle. Jillian Williams is here to help us determine what way or combination of methods you can take to obtain startup financing specifically. So tell us, I heard you say that you're in Florida now, kind of quarantining. How has your life been since the coronavirus outbreak has hit? And I know specifically in New York, you all are getting it pretty bad. So just curious of kind of like what life changes you had to make in your day-to-day work life as well.
Yeah, of course. So I mean, I think probably the biggest life change was that I was supposed to go on vacation sort of as it was getting pretty bad and actually fly through Miami. And so I came down here when I was supposed to go to Colombia, and I was like, you know what, I don't really want to get stuck in a foreign country, so I'll just spend the weekend down in Florida and then come back. That was like 4 weeks ago now. I have very little clothing around me. So I mean, obviously some the not leaving the house as much has changed in terms of my day-to-day. But really in terms of work, I'd say the way I always describe the life of a VC is sort of in 3 parts. So one is sort of sourcing deals, and that involves everything from going to events, meeting different ways of meeting founders, and interacting with other VCs, et cetera, and just networking that way. So obviously that's changed quite a bit to a lot of it being online, no events anymore at all. So some of that organic meeting is a little bit harder. Obviously, there's great webinars and things online, but you definitely kind of don't get that same sense of let me just run into someone. Second part is sort of the due diligence on companies. I think that for the most part has actually stayed the same for us. And then the last part, and I think due diligence through to making investments, I'd say where that's probably changed is like just taking a little bit longer. One of the great things about how we are structured at Anthemis, because our team is global, is that I actually spent a lot of time on Zoom prior to this.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our team meetings have actually been the same. We actually were joking where once everybody was working from home, we all constantly were turning on our camera. And then we realized, wait, we've been doing only Zoom meetings with our entire team for a while without the camera on. Like, why are we switching this behavior? So we quickly got rid of the camera already. So that's actually been a pretty seamless change. And then the last part is with the portfolio companies. And I think that that's probably where most of my attention has been spent. While we're sort of still actively looking at new companies, meeting new companies, we actually gave a term sheet for a company last week, I think last Friday. So still trying to do deals. We also have a lot of focus on our portfolio. So first of all, making sure that they can weather the storm, and especially around the uncertainty in terms of not only how long are we all going to be home, but then after that, what's happening in terms of our economy and what type of recession are we likely going to be in and how long will that recovery take? And then also on top of that, I think most recently has been sort of with the payment protection provisions and the small business loans. And there's a lot of uncertainty around how it impacts startups, especially in the venture capital space. And so I've spent quite a bit of time the last few days just on phones with lawyers, companies, etc., trying to figure out what exactly this means for our companies and are they eligible and how can we help them apply.
Nice. I was wondering, I was like, are you all still doing any lending or any kind of VC companies or for, to say, are they doing any lending? Because I've been getting emails from just like, like I have a payment processor with like PayPal and Square, and they're like, yeah, like our working capital loans, we're not doing any of them right now. So I was curious if banks are still doing lending just because of the times that we're in right now.
Yeah, so we focus on equity, so not on the debt side. So that's a little bit different, but I will say, I mean, obviously because of the SBA loans, they sort of have to be lending. But I do think that the debt market is definitely going to be tougher. And I think just from talking anecdotally to other VCs and what they're seeing, especially ones that are a bit more heavily focused on lending, they're seeing a lot of where it's just kind of people stepping back a little bit to figure out what's going to happen. And I think part of that, both on the business side as well as the consumer side, is that we've had the highest debt levels as a nation, as a world, in recent history, both from when it comes from student loans to just personal loans, etc.
Right.
And so I think given the rate in which businesses are shutting down, people are losing their jobs, I think the idea of lending, and I think Jamie Dimon actually said this in his message as chairman of JP Morgan the other day, just around like what's going to happen in terms of defaults. And I do think on the lending side, they probably are taking a step back to figure out sort of what's going to happen before actively providing new loans.
Okay, nice. Well, that was very helpful to know. And I hope if anybody on the call today, if they are seeking any lending, because I know quite a few people who had huge business plans and they've had to be halted, or they're afraid to move forward because they don't want rejections and so forth, that I guess you just have to make sure your stuff is even more thorough.
Exactly. I think that's one thing, and even from our investment standpoint that we're looking at, and as we're still looking at new deals, a lot of the obviously kind of saying that things will take a little longer, but and I think you've probably heard, if you listen to anyone in the VC space, they're saying sort of like higher hurdles. That's not necessarily saying that like we were doing bad deals before and now we're going to do a lot better. It's more so we were in a very different environment before. We were in an environment of surplus capital, people able to spend, etc. And now we have to think about it. And the way that we're focused is, what does this company look like in a more depressed economy, in a space where consumers don't have the capital to spend as much, in a space where decisions are just slower. And so it's really just looking at it with a new lens. And so if there's a way for you to sort of position your company with that light of like, actually, there are these tailwinds behind it. So like B2B enterprise sales, while probably slower, especially if you're focused on moving things into the cloud or helping bring technology to a lot of slower and more archaic industries, that probably is a tailwind right now because of how bad it was for a lot of like large banks and things like that, that their employees didn't even have laptops and had zero infrastructure to work from home. And now all of a sudden they realize like, oh, this might only be a blimp that this is happening, but we do actually need to find ways to use technology to improve our business, to allow us to work in a world where remote working is a possibility.
Right. Anyone on the call, did they face if you are working from home, did you have some issues with trying to work from home just based on not having the necessary things like laptops or iPads, even down to internet? Because I know like quite a few places here, like there was a shortage here in North Carolina just to obtain laptops for some county employees and stuff because they just didn't have enough. And then it was difficult in getting them because they have to get, secured ones and all the other, like you can't just go to, Best Buy and pick up a computer type thing. And so I know that it was some difficulties here in our county government for people to be able to work from home. So that was really stressful for several employees that I know personally, because I used to work for the county. So let's see, Nicole said that equipment was good, but the problem with everybody working on the company website was the issue. So, and Crystal said that they had a shortage for the first 2 weeks, no laptops, only phone calls. So they let people go on the administrative side of her company as well. So sounds like they need to be in contact with Jillian for some funding. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the question. So before we kind of digged a little bit in just the first question about the outbreak, but can you define what is considered an actual startup company?
Yeah, I think that there's very different definitions of them. The way that we think about them, and that's given that we're focused on the early stage, is that it's a business that is really in its earliest days. So whether it's just still an idea to MVP, so a minimum viable product, to something that's launched, but you're still kind of trying to figure out product market fit. And I think that's the key thing, is we typically look at startups where you think you have this idea of who your target customer is and where you're going to excel, but it's not necessarily proven quite yet. And so we think about it from that point of view. I think we are typically looking for venture scalable startups. So that means startups that can become worth $1 billion plus, et cetera. And main reason for that is, like, similar to when we invest in companies, you're sort of beholden to investors. We're beholden to our own investors, which are limited partners or LPs. And so we have to constantly think about the returns that we're providing them. And so I think startup is this very broad term and I think that what gets glamorized in the world is the Ubers, et cetera, that are like more of the venture scalable businesses, when you have tons of people that are like more like the mom and pops starting companies that can be terrific businesses for the founders and make them a lot of money, but aren't necessarily venture scalable businesses. And I think that's where a lot of people can get confused and blur the line, because I think it's very sexy to raise venture, but oftentimes, like, you don't want to. If you can build a big business where you don't have outside input from investors, it's like, we can be annoying. And also, if you're able to grow it without necessarily diluting yourself, that's important as well. And so I think all of that kind of feeds into what a startup is, but we're really focused on sort of what are these ideas that can really revolutionize an industry, a sector, et cetera.
Nice. So you said a couple of things that kind of turned off a few light bulbs for me, because like you said, you know, raising venture capital can come off as very attractive or sexy. And I think that is like the word of I think it started in like 2018, where everyone was like, you know, you saw all these news headlines, like such and such raised $1 million for her, you know, in VC funding, and this person did this and this person did that. And the companies, I don't see them anymore. I don't see exactly what it is that they're doing. And I didn't really 100% understand what they were doing from the beginning, outside of, you know, maybe some different type of, like, maybe it was like I think it was one time, it was a young lady, she had like a blog and she would put on like different events and things like that. And I was just like, so people are raising VC funding for these kind of companies? I thought that they were a little bit more on a larger scale. So that's why I wanted to get more, I know I did, and several other people I talked to wanted to get more clarification, because it is pounded in our heads now as small business owners to try to raise VC funding. So is it just your company per se that you kind of don't function, that you don't focus on, like, you know, your mom and pop smaller businesses, or is it that kind of industry standard?
I think it's an industry standard. And again, what does like a mom and pop business mean? I'm thinking more of if you're trying to open up a dry cleaner down the road or something. Sure, that can be a great business. But I think one thing, and I think especially for us, and what becomes glamorized in the VC space, is like this tech-enabled business. And so what allows a business to scale to become a big business? And I think that's the real importance. And there's oftentimes where we'll speak to founders that are raising, and there's actually a company I spoke to not that long ago, and they had like 180,000 daily active users after having raised like 250K. They'd been operating this way and growing for like year over year, like 100%. And my main question to him was, why are you raising? Like, you can build a very attractive business. You've clearly been able to do it without raising too much money. Like, you don't need to raise this money to be able to figure that out. And I think that, and I think this might get into one of your later questions, is that because it's always so glamorized to raise capital, it sometimes is important to take a step back and really try to understand, like, why do you need this capital, and what will that additional capital do for you in terms of growth? If you can't really figure that out, then maybe it's not the right business to raise capital, and maybe it's not the right time for you to raise capital. I think that's really important, because timing can be extremely crucial as well. But at the same time, like, to your point, VC is very subjective. You're pitching to people, you're pitching in just sometimes different moods, different etc., different theses, whatever it is can make or break why you get funded. And so even as someone who's in VC, you see a lot of deals that get done and you're like, who would ever possibly put money into this? This makes no sense. And I'm sure people think that about some of our deals as well. And then time will tell. I mean, that's the thing, is even with all startups, it's like 1% of companies become successful. And then even with VC-backed companies, that's an extremely, extremely tiny number. And I think out of most portfolios, people expect about like 2/3 of your portfolio to end up failing. So you're making bets with this idea that this can be, sometimes it's, like Peter Thiel has a book called 0 to 1, and you're thinking of like, is this going to revolutionize the world, or is it going to become zero? That's often the way. Hopefully you have some in between that can make you some money and make the founder some money and not be complete zeros. But oftentimes some of the biggest ones are ones that are either going to be successful or they're not.
Right. Okay. So with all that information, can you tell us like some of the first steps that you actually need to take in order before you actually even start seeking funding? Like, what are some of the key things that you're looking at when someone walks through your door and says, I want to schedule an appointment because I'm seeking, funding for my business?
Yeah. I think the first thing that I always want to see is how much can you get done without raising capital? So is it that you have this idea and immediately you're like, okay, I want to raise venture capital? Like that works for some people, candidly, and that works typically. There's a stereotype of what they look like, and they've probably done this before and they have all the right connections. For 99% of the world, that does not work. And what we really want to see is how scrappy are you? Because that's one thing that's extremely important when you're starting a company. And how much are you able to figure out how to get done without raising capital? And so some of that means you continuing your current job, because not everybody has the means to quit their job and not take an income, but working nights and weekends and trying to figure out how much you can get done on your own without taking additional capital. And that still means it's sort of like leaning on advisors, other people in your network, etc. But just wanting to see that you're able to at least figure out a plan for what you want to do as much research testing. If it's just talking to people, if you're doing a consumer business and you just want to make sure you're targeting the right type of consumer, having conversations with the people that are in that cohort and making sure you're building something that actually solves a pain point for them. If that's trying to iterate on whatever the product is and just get even just mock-ups of what it could look like. I think that's extremely important. So really trying to do a lot of research and testing as much as you can up front, I think is extremely important. And then, especially when you're coming with an ask for capital, it's really knowing how much you need and being able to at least provide a plan for why you need that and what that will do. So kind of going back to my earlier point. So if you're saying I want to raise 500 to $1 million, kind of have an idea of what that 500K gets you and what that $1 million gets you. And really being able to understand and tell what the use of funds is, I think is extremely important. So I think that those are two of the big things for me, because I think there's oftentimes you'll see a founder that comes in and they're just like, all right, we want to raise venture capital to do X, Y, and Z. And like, they haven't done anything, they haven't proven anything. And it's like, cool, this might be an interesting idea, but do something to prove that it has legs initially. And then the other time is, this is probably more on the Series A stage, but there'll be sometimes where we have founders come up to us and be like, oh, we want to raise it at 5 to 10 million. And like, okay, what's the difference between those? Those are pretty different amounts. What's the difference? And they don't really have a rationale for one or the other. It's just kind of like, I want to raise as much as possible. And I think the last point I'll also say is, especially with, and we'll see what happens with the market now, but for a while you were seeing people trying to raise more and more money at the earlier stage. And that's not always necessarily good. It's not always necessarily great to have a VC in at the earliest stage, because as I said before, VC comes with money, comes with strings attached. We have people that we're reporting to, and we have information rights, different control provisions, etc., that come with that. And so it limits your ability to test a little bit more, because the second you raise venture capital money, there's kind of like a clock in terms of where you need to get to raise your next round. And so being able to be as scrappy as possible, being able to iterate and test and kind of giving yourself that flexibility to fail a little bit is extremely important, and becomes harder with the more capital that you raise.
So when you say like kind of coming with, that knowledge or that research, is this in a presentation form, or is this more so kind of like knowing the information to the point that you don't have to refer to any kind of notes, or are presentations, such things like pitch decks or just like a portfolio itself, is that more attractive, or will that kind of gain your at least your level of interest initially?
I think it's both. I think where I find pitch decks to be helpful is especially sort of as a reference more so. So maybe sometimes it's like before we even chat, you don't need to have a pitch deck, but it could be sending an email of what's interest, like what your company is doing, why it fits our thesis, etc. Pitch decks can be a helpful way to just do that as well, because I can kind of scan through and be like, okay, yes, this makes sense, or oh no, actually this doesn't fit our thesis, not right. And so I do think those are good, and they're always good to have as sort of like something to walk through. I think two things I'd probably say is, one is you want it to, so like probably what we all heard in school growing up in terms of like, don't read the presentation and just stand in front of it and read every single line. Like, have it more so just like to guide the framework and the flow of the conversation. But being able to present what you're thinking. And also, a lot of times VCs are just going to kind of jump in with questions and not necessarily let you just run through the presentation exactly how you think. And just allowing that and being comfortable and kind of making sure you know what you're talking about. I think to your point in terms of memorizing things, like, yes, you want to make sure that you understand every detail about what you're talking about, but at the same time, it's okay if you don't know things. So we're going to ask questions that don't necessarily expect you have every single answer. And rather than trying to pretend like you do, just kind of being like, you know what, I hadn't thought about that, but now that you bring it up, here's how I would think about that in my business.
Right.
Or let me go back and do some more research on that and get back to you because I want to give a better answer. But we want to make sure, like in any situation, when I'm a founder is pitching me, I am not the expert on the space or the company. They are. They should be the one that are teaching me something. And so that's just something to remember as well.
Right. Nice. Just curious, because it's been a differentiate of opinions as it relates to whether or not you should have the presentations or you should not have them, or, you know, just I've heard different people give different, you know, kind of feedback on kind of how that should go. And by the way, I am not seeking like any kind of VC funding, but I like to just know any and everything that I can know, because you never know what could happen 5 years from now. But I've just heard different people say different things.
I think you should have something. It doesn't need to be a 30-page deck. It could be a 10-page or sometimes even like a 2-page or 1-pager, just something that you can provide to people to quickly scan through and understand what you're focused on.
Nice. So kind of going into our next question. So I heard you say things like, you know, startup and Series A and early seed and all the other, you know, fancy terms. What are the actual different stages of funding? Yeah.
So there's a few different at the earliest stage. So if you said probably like 5 years ago, the earliest stage was probably pre-seed. Now there's like the angel / friends and family. I like saying angel more because not everybody has friends and family that could cough up whether it's $10,000 or $100,000. But so typically the earliest is sort of someone bootstrapping. So meaning that they're not raising any money, they're trying to do it themselves. And then the earliest stage of where you and then there's a stage where you probably say like angel investing. So maybe you can sort of tap into, and there's increasingly more and more angel groups. So they have a lot of ones specifically focused on women, or ones in specific regions as well, that have like pitch competitions and things like that, and will give check sizes anywhere from like 10 to 50K to different founders. And so that's sort of the earliest probable stage of raising outside capital. That's usually done through some sort of a convertible note or a safe note, so not necessarily pure equity at that time. And then the next stage would be more pre-seed, which is a combination of still angels as well as maybe an institution. More and more there are institutional pre-seed investors, so their fund sizes might be more like 10 million to 30 million, and they're focused on the pre-seed stage. And then you have the seed stage. So seed stage is typically the first institutional round, but of course that's changing a little bit. And then Series A. And so, I mean, what a company looks like at each of those stages varies significantly. We have some Series A companies that are launched and raising capital. We have some Series A companies that when we first invested, were still pre-launched. They usually have a product by the time you're at Series A. So, and it's surprising if they're not launched, but they usually at least have something built. Seed is typically where you're kind of finalizing that minimum viable product and you're like getting ready to launch. And pre-seed and before is usually still more of like that research ideation stage.
So anyone on the call today, what stage of funding would you think that you qualify for? Just curious if anyone thinks that any of these particular stages relate to their company. I feel like I'm forever going to be stuck in bootstrapping. Like, I don't know what I'm going to get out of it. I need to start speaking that I'm going to be at Series A sooner than later, or even beyond that. But the bootstrapping still feels real. And I'm sure that probably is going to be like pretty consistent for most people. You know, that they feel like they're just always like trying to make a sale or, you know, basically a sale in order to pay for the next thing type thing. And so I think that's been kind of my difficulty, because I have two businesses. I'm a wedding and event planner. I've been doing that for 9 years. And then I have this my women's brand company that's only 3 years in. And so it's just like both of them, it just seemed like it's a cycle of just trying to like get pulled out. So then that's when funding was introduced to me, but I'm kind of scared of it because I'm like, I don't know. I can't see how either one of them would make sense, or how I would even be able to pay it. But I guess that's where conversations like this make sense in order to have it.
Yeah, and I think there also are increasingly alternatives to venture capital and to traditional venture capital. So there are companies like, especially if you're in the consumer brand or more of like the product space, there are companies like Clearbank that are able to give you like inventory loans and things like that. And rather than you getting equity or selling equity for capital, which is a lot more expensive in the long run, able to help you fund your sales and fund the products that you need to produce. And so I think that obviously it always depends on the type of company, but there are more and more interesting other alternatives as well.
Nice. We had a couple of comments that came through. Let me pull them up. Crystal just said that she agreed. I'm assuming you all agree with me about the bootstrapping. And then she said that she's always trying to make a sale to get the next set of merchandise that she actually needs. So
to Crystal's point, Crystal's point, something like a Clearbank or some of these alternatives could be very interesting for you, because they allow, rather than you kind of raising venture capital money, they allow you to use it's like a form of debt, but they allow you to kind of do it based off of your orders flow already.
Nice. So with you know, some of the struggles that, you know, maybe we feel like could potentially be a pushback, what type of companies or businesses actually receive that pushback or rejection that you see in startup funding? It doesn't even necessarily have to be 100% within your company, because I know you all have a focus on certain things. So of course, I know if I came in there and wanted a hair salon, that wouldn't qualify. But what type of, you know, businesses or companies do you see that receive more pushback? And then what kind of companies do you see that actually receive a little bit more opportunities in funding itself?
Yeah, I think especially more recently, consumer brands is a tough market, especially for traditional VCs. I think there's still opportunity at the earliest sort of angel pre-seed and a little bit on the seed stage, but the challenge is, and I think if you look at some of the ones that have done well and are public, like Casper, etc., it's really hard. So they are like if I'm taking Casper, for example, what people thought about it is, well, it's kind of like a one-time purchase. You buy a mattress once every like 7 to 10 years or something like that. It was a high value purchase. And so we thought that sort of that made up for it. Or you see a lot, Away Suitcase, their margins are rather strong, but how often do you buy a suitcase? So that's why they keep coming out with more products. And so I think the challenge that you have to think about, especially if it's a consumer brand, is how often are people buying it, which is why subscription models have been extremely attractive. So kind of to answer the second part of your question, repeat buying is extremely attractive.
Yeah.
And then also, how much is it? If it's a repeat purchase, but it's only a $2 purchase, maybe not that great, but something like Harry's Dollar Shave Club and Harry's and whatnot, a repeat purchase of something that men constantly need razors, that becomes a pretty attractive business. And so I think business model is extremely important in those cases, where instead of just making a one-off purchase, you want to kind of create that relationship with the company or with the consumer that has them coming back again and again. And so that's one area. And then I think another one that maybe I'm not as attracted to is pure brick and mortar businesses as well. So if you have a storefront real estate, I think there's a very good model to have sort of like the omni-channel, which is both online and storefront. But I think if it's purely storefront, I think that can be a little bit challenging just because of the high real estate costs and things like that. And I think maybe also in this coronavirus world, given that if you don't have an online presence, then you're not making any sales, that can become extremely difficult as well. And so to some of the areas that I find interesting, I think really where, like, the question I always want to ask is like, how big can this be? And what are you making sure your solution is solving a problem? I think there's oftentimes where people come up with companies where they're like, oh, I have this great solution, it's going to be perfect, but what is the problem? Or you're maybe solving a part of the problem, but you're missing the bigger picture. And so I think that's the question to constantly ask yourself in terms of, am I really solving, is there like a there that I'm solving, or am I kind of like squishing this round peg into the square hole to make it fit? And so I think a lot of that can come from business models. So as I was talking about, like, subscription models become really interesting. And I think SaaS, so software as a service, is an area that sort of has become extremely sexy for venture capitalists. Because especially if you look at a lot of the companies that have done well in the public market recently, I mean, Zoom has other reasons now why it's doing well. But if you look at last year of a lot of the companies that ended up doing well, it's ones where you have sort of that repeat purchase as well. And so I think that that's extremely interesting. And then I think you're seeing enterprise sales do well. And I think what I really like, especially for thinking on the consumer side, is sort of like that B2B2C, so business to business to consumer. So typically you're selling to businesses, so like Slack, for example, but the consumer is really the one that's using it. And that's really the one that's driving the engagement and driving the success of the company. And so if you can find interesting ways to sell products that aren't purely to consumer, only because consumer sales can be extremely expensive, I think that's an important way to think about it. And more sales on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat are just getting more expensive as they have increasing purchase power. And so finding alternatives is very important as well.
So you definitely said something that is like super important. That is like that reoccurring, that customer constantly coming back. Because that was some of the things that I ran into just with starting this particular brand. Not necessarily the wedding event planning was a little easier. It was just kind of consulting, getting the clients, building a portfolio, and I was off the ground with that. But with this, with being more so, event-based, print and digital publications, webinars, so forth, conference, seeking those sponsorships, those different, I had people that wanted to invest in it, that angel kind of investor. One of the number one things they kept asking me was, well, how do you continuously bring people back? Not on a selling standpoint, but they're locked in for like a year or 2 years or however long you want to go. And someone had mentioned to me kind of the way that, for instance, like Rent the Runway works. You get a membership with them, you pay a yearly fee, and then you get to rotate out for different garments throughout the year. And that was so clever, because if you're anyone like me that goes a million places, buying all these clothes can just be ridiculous. You know, that's been something that I personally have been trying to figure out how I want to continuously try to like bring people in so they're locked in and they don't have to continuously have to keep clicking and going to the website and ordering it and coming back and ordering again, and, you know, and so forth. So to hear it again just gave even more confirmation for me personally. And I think for a lot of the ladies on the line too, because we've had a couple of different webinars where people have asked questions about, you know, getting that clientele or getting people to buy in and so forth. And I think having the reoccurrence of people coming back or being locked in for a year to 6 months or a month-to-month basis, whatever the case may be, is probably going to be key for most businesses at this point to you know, remain sustainable. And I think this definitely opened everybody's eyes for sure during this pandemic, because we were not expecting this. And a lot of people are probably losing out on money because they don't have those consistent buys or those, you know, credit card swipes that happen every single month.
Exactly.
So, beyond that, ladies, do you all have any other questions or anything like that that you kind of want to share? I did want to kind of talk about some of the ladies that we have on the line, their businesses. I don't know what's going on with my light today. This keeps moving. Maybe I'm talking with my hands too much. But I know that I wanted some of the ladies to be able to share the companies that they have. And if they had any particular, you know, specific funding questions, because what I've seen most frequently from the ladies that are engaged with the brand or that have been on the webinars, I've seen several consulting companies from any array of, you know, events to financial planning. We've had, you know, the different therapists and so forth. And then we've also seen, I had one lady, she was on here and she has her husband, they do like comedy lounges. They kind of go around and they kind of host different like comedy shows, and they do big events and things like that. Do you see companies that kind of that I've named, and if anyone else has any other companies that they want to name as well, receive any kind of additional funding, or are those kind of still more going to be on the bootstrap or angel investing side?
Yeah, I think it depends. Again, I think that like sort of like the comedy center that you mentioned, like I think again, sort of the question comes back to how do things scale? And I think scale is the key word when it comes to venture capital, is really how does it efficiently grow and become really big? And so that's a perfect example of a business where I've probably full faith that it could be a very great business, and there are definitely ways and needs for you to raise other types of capital, but maybe venture capital isn't the best way. So maybe it is some sort of debt capital or something like that. Or you also, if it's around buying, if it's around purchasing real estate, there are other alternatives that are more so like real estate investors and things like that, that would be willing to sort of put capital in, and maybe you pay them off in terms of like some of the revenue share and things like that. So things like that, where again, it's sort of constantly asking yourself, what makes this scale quickly and efficiently at some point? And obviously that doesn't mean in the first year that it's around first 2 years, but is there that sort of apex that it can hit and that it can scale very efficiently? And I think you think of like, again, taking big tech examples, but like a WeWork, for example, and that was one of the big challenges with it from the beginning, is that it was never a tech company. It was always a real estate company. And so even though it grew to be this massive thing, which it probably shouldn't have, you had that question in like, how does this scale beyond just like constantly buying real estate? And that was a big challenge for it, and why it ended up, I mean, it's still around obviously, but not having the exit that many people thought it would be.
Right. They filed for bankruptcy, right?
Yeah, and they're suing SoftBank, their investor, now as well. So it's a lot going on. Exactly.
Too much going on. I knew something. I didn't feel good about signing up for it when they kind of were like aggressively calling me, asking me to become a member because they opened like 2 offices here. I'm in Durham, North Carolina.
Yeah.
But I was just like, it just seems weird. Like the model was kind of throwing me off.
Yeah.
And then when everything hit the fan, I was like, I'm going to stick with the
Yeah.
smaller, because it's a smaller kind of co-working space here that I have a membership with. So I was just like, I'm just going to roll with that one. Because it just didn't seem like, anything that grows really, really, really fast, I'm always nervous about it. And it's typically, and so this is kind of part, I have another question, kind of a bonus question I want to throw in there. We hear a lot about women having issues with obtaining funding. Kind of in your role and in your previous roles, are more of your clientele women? Are they actually women of color? Or are they more so men?
Yeah. So I mean, especially in my previous roles, sorry about the phone ringing, but I've been in finance my whole life. And so I was typically the only woman, or definitely the only woman of color around. And so with Anthemis, I think one of the great things is that one of our co-founders is a female. And so there's been a very big focus on making sure we have a diverse team. And so in terms of our investment team, I think it's about 40% women overall, but 60% are sort of the decision makers. And so that looks very different from most other VCs, I will say.
Yeah.
And I think a challenge is that we're also taking 2 industries, so tech and finance, that have never been that friendly towards women or people of color, and putting them together. And so for us, I will say, unfortunately, our portfolio hasn't been that diverse. However, this was something that we really focused on last year. And part of that meant that we actually launched in partnership with Berkeley something that we call the Female Innovators Lab. And so what that's doing is trying to encourage, actually, so we're starting at like the earliest stage, more women to start companies within the financial services sector. And because we saw a lot of men leaving finance and starting companies for problems that they saw, but we did not see that with women as much. And typically, if they did look to start a company, it then was something more in like a consumer brand focused on women. And so we were like, how can we help to solve this? And so it's more of a pre-seed incubator for female founders, and that we help them get to that point of being able to raise seed stage capital. So we work with them from everything that it's really tailored to what the company needs. But we work with them from everything from go-to-market strategy, business strategy, product development, tech development, etc., recruiting team. And it's very hands-on, and helping them then, once it's sort of ready, network and get them in front of the right investors that would look to invest in the round and continue the growth of the company. And so that's something that I help launch, because being a woman and realizing that 90% of the time I was meeting with a team of men, even when it was sometimes a company focused on women, got frustrating. And so wanting to kind of encourage that more as well. And I think you see a lot more of those types of funds popping up as well. You have Harlem Capital Partners also in New York. We're also investors into Backstage Capital, which is led by Arlen Hamilton. We also have Precursor out in San Francisco by Charles Hudson. And so you're seeing a lot more of these funds that are trying to support both women and people of color. And I think it's extremely important, because I think that honestly, if you keep sort of washing, repeating the same model for finding companies in the most selfish and capitalist way, you're not going to find the best companies, because you're missing out on under-tapped talent and undiscovered talent. And so I think it's like, obviously there is a part of me that also just like wants to see more people that look like me starting companies, but also it's a selfish way I want to find other ways that maybe some other investors are missing on, in terms of investing into companies that can be very big. And so that's really important from my point of view as well.
Nice. Ladies, please, while we're going into our last question, if you have any specific questions about your business, just go ahead and put those in the chat box. And so, you know, you've given us a lot, like a whole lot. I'm definitely going to be sharing this video with a couple of people I know that are in the male and female that have been looking for funding and kind of trying to get like their idea off the ground. So I wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to tell us, like, what are some things that you're working on during, you know, this mandated time of rest and shut in. You know, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to doing besides just going outside with no fear once all this is over as well?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I think some of the things that I've been working on is also just kind of using the time to like to think a little bit more as well, and especially in terms of thesis development and where I think opportunities are in the space and in the world, and just kind of using this time to really sit back and, okay, what does the world in this new normal that at some point we'll get back into look like, and what are some of the opportunities around that? And so I think that's something I always want to be doing and always try to be doing, but obviously different times things are constantly going on, and so having that time to just sit down and think can be more of a luxury, and so I think that's something that I've been focusing on as well as like more on a personal note, I was pretty lazy the first 2 months of this year in terms of working out, and trying to kind of get back into that as well, especially as I have a little bit more time without commuting and things like that, and so definitely trying to do that as well. Things that I'm excited for once we get back into this new world is like definitely getting outside. I mean, I think I've been lucky that I've been quarantined with my family, and so I've been seeing them a lot, but just kind of seeing other people, I think will be nice as well, and just kind of getting back to some sort of normalcy. And then also probably having more than 3 shirts to wear as well.
So you went down there with just like, I'm just going down here for a little bit, and then
came down with like a purse. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, it sounds like you need to get on Amazon and get you a couple of little things here and there.
But then if I'm not leaving the house, I'm kind of like,
Why? Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Jillian, I really appreciate this conversation today. I am like so like kind of like nerdy when it comes to anything finances, money, whatever the case may be, because like I said, I feel like I've been in a bootstrap phase for like almost 9 years now, and I'm ready to get out of it.
Yeah.
So I personally really do appreciate this conversation. I know our listeners do too today as well, and the ladies that will have the opportunity to look at the playback as well. So thank you so much. Please enjoy Florida as much as possible, because us here in North Carolina are jealous for sure. I wish that I was quarantined in a sunny state, but I know it's different when you can't really move about the way that you want to. But please stay safe. Again, I highly appreciate your time today. Did you have any other information that you wanted to share with anyone before we end out today?
Yeah, nothing from me, but feel free to reach out to me. My email is my first name, Jillian@anthemis.com. And also you can find me at Twitter, JillWillNYC.
All right. Well, I thank you so much again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Perfect. Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye.